This video is an introductory video to the law of reflection. So in the video, what we're going to do is just get a rough idea what the law of reflection is, and then later in the learning activities, what you're going to do is you're going to explore, well, what actually is the law of reflection. So before we start, what I want you to do is make sure that you have your notes handout. It's a fill in the blanks handout, and as you're watching the video, you can fill in the blanks to make sure that you have the notes and the information that you need for this section. It does not follow step by step, word for word of the video. I'll do the best I can, but it won't necessarily say word for word of what's on your notes. So you need to pay attention, you need to be thinking about what's being talked about and make sure that you have the correct information. So the first thing I'd like you to do is I'd like you to look at this picture as a group. It's a beautiful scenic picture of a lake and a mountain. What I would like you to do is pause the video and discuss with your group what property of light this picture is demonstrating. So pause and take about 1 minute to discuss with your group. Now that you've paused the video and you've had a little bit of a discussion, hopefully you've come up with the idea that this is demonstrating reflection. So basically what's happening in this picture is the lake is nice and smooth, and what's happening is the light is bouncing off the lake and reflecting an image of the mountain. This is actually called mirror lake. So when it's nice and smooth, you can actually, it acts like a mirror. Now before we get started on the new information, we need to know what we already know about light. So we know that light travels in straight lines, and that's called the rectilinear propagation of light. So it just travels in straight lines. It can't bend necessarily without following a specific rule of bending. It can't curve around something. It travels in straight lines unless it hits an object. Now the new information that we're going to look at today is when light hits something, it can cause it to bend. So I just said light couldn't bend. Well, in this case, when it hits an object, it may cause it to bend, scatter, or reflect, or it can do a combination of those three. So when the law of reflection describes how light reflects from a plane mirror. So that's just a perfectly flat plane mirror. And reflection is basically called a change of direction. So it's basically light being bounced off or changing direction. So in this video and through the learning activities, you're going to look at some essential questions, and those include what is reflection. So hopefully by the end of this you'll understand what reflection is. The second one you're going to look at is what tools could be used to investigate the law of reflection. That's going to be done in the activity, the learning activity, where you're doing a hands-on little lab type activity or investigate activity. And then the last one is, what is the mathematical relationship between the angle of incidence and the angle of reflection? So that's basically fancy terminology for saying how can we predict when light's going into a mirror, what's going to happen, how it's going to bounce off, and where it's going to bounce off. There's actually a formula or a calculation that can be made to predict that. So in the initial activity that you had the sun and you had the flower and you had to follow the path. So when you were doing that, you were probably experimenting a little bit, looking at mirrors and looking at placement of mirrors. So you hopefully got, my mirror's not very straight, you hopefully got the idea that if you put two mirrors, what would happen is the light of the sun would bounce, or the light of the ray, which we consider to be the sun, would go from the sun, go there, bounce off the mirror, and then come to hit the flower. So you probably use trial and error to see the angle of that mirror, where the mirrors need to be, and the angle of the mirror, and played with it, and hopefully you were able to figure out how to get that light bend down. In the learning activities, what we're going to do is we're going to use the law of reflection so that we don't have to use trial and error. We'll have an actual understanding of, oh, okay, this is exactly where the mirror needs to go, and this is why the mirror needs to go there. So what I'm going to do is you need some key vocabulary, first of all, to understand what's happening and you understand the law of reflection. So here we go. A key vocabulary is something called an incident ray. So incident is like the initiation. So the incident ray is the ray that's coming out of the light source. So there's the incident ray. Okay, and again, it's shown by the direction. See, there's a directional arrow right there showing it's coming from the light source going into the mirror. You'll notice that the mirror has lines on the back of it. That shows that's the back of the mirror versus the front of the mirror. Then another word you'll need to understand is something called the normal. Now this is a line that's an imaginary line, but you draw it here. It's basically a parallel line coming out from the mirror, from the center of the mirror, and it's called the normal. This is where what you would use to measure the difference between the incident ray and the reflecting ray. So the reflecting ray is this right here. So reflecting ray. That's the ray that's coming off of the mirror, or the change in direction. Okay. Then what you're going to do is you're going to have to figure out, there's something called an angle of incidence. So we can represent that with the mathematical symbol of angle I. So that's the angle of incidence. Incidence. Oops, sorry. Sorry about the messiness there, but you get what I mean. And then the angle that the light's coming out from the normal is called the angle of reflection. Okay, so knowing all of those key vocabulary words are really important because you're going to have to use that vocabulary when describing what the law of reflection is. Now, if you notice, I haven't explained what the law of reflection is, because in the next activity, you're going to look at and calculate the mathematical relationship between angle of incidence and angle of reflection. So how does the light come in, and how can we predict where it's going to reflect, and the reflecting ray is going to come out? So what you're going to do is basically determine what the law of reflection is through experimentation. So you can stop the video and you can start looking at your learning activity to learn about the law of reflection or figure out the law of reflection.